Today, I'm going to tell you a story so intense it turned fear into legend, unfolding beneath the scorching sun of the Old West, where every shadow hides a secret and every stranger could be your last mistake. This was a place ruled not by law, but by reputation, and by the men brave or foolish enough to test it. And it all started with one small decision. A quiet moment that would soon leave an entire town trembling. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The stagecoach creaked along Main Street like a relic that had lost its century, its boards sun-bleached, its leather cracked and sagging, a wagon that belonged among headstones, not rolling through the dust of Redemption Creek. 4 men spilled out of the saloon, pistols hanging low at their belts. They tracked the coach with lazy eyes, the way buzzards study something that hasn't quite stopped breathing. The driver was a gray-bearded man, somewhere past 50, wrapped in clothes stiff with neglect. He never looked their way. His hat shadowed his face, his spine bent just enough to seem broken. Everything about him whispered harmless. Everything about him lied. "Would you look at that?" The first gunman snorted, his voice soaked in mockery. "An old fool driving his own coffin," another added, "probably hauling his grave with him." Laughter burst out around them. None of them knew they were laughing at a living legend. They had no idea that inside that hollow-looking coach sat 3 of the deadliest men the West had ever feared. Men worth enough bounty to buy valleys and cattle empires. Men whose blood-stained paths ran from Texas clear to California. Men officially listed as ghosts. Yet this quiet driver, this unseen man, had taken them all alive and was hauling them toward Fort McCullough for the reward. What the 4 gunmen failed to realize was that they too were wanted. Their faces stared back from posters nailed in saloons across the territory. The moment they got close enough to see inside that coach, the balance would tip. In less than half a minute, Redemption Creek would earn its name. The lead gunman stepped into the street, blocking the coach outright. His name was Vance Crowell, a petty outlaw puffed up on borrowed confidence, known for bullying shopkeepers and cheating card tables. Real violence had never tested him. That was about to change. The coach rolled to a halt. The driver didn't flinch. He didn't speak. The reins lay loose in his scarred hands, as if the men in front of him barely existed. That silence cut deeper than an insult. "Hold it right there, old man," Crowell barked, fingers brushing his revolver. His 3 companions, Holt Mercer, Rusk Holden, and Orrin Pike, spread wide, sealing off every escape. This was their ground, their law. The wagon didn't move. "I said stop," Crowell snarled, stepping closer and grabbing the side rail. "You deaf old-timer or just dumb?" The driver stared ahead, gray eyes fixed on nothing any of them could see. His jaw was clenched tight, tendons standing out beneath weathered skin. "What you got in there?" one of the gunmen asked, leaning toward the window. "Anything worth stealing?" That's when Crowell noticed it. A flicker inside, a shape shifting in the dark. Another presence. He met his men's eyes, a dangerous idea forming. "Looks like you're hauling company," Crowell said, his grin sharpening. "What's the price on an old man and his cargo? $30 maybe?" "More than you'll ever see breathing," the driver replied softly. His voice rasped like stone dragged through a canyon. That was the mistake. Crowell's hand snapped toward his pistol, fury igniting in his eyes. But before his fingers touched leather, the coach door slammed open with brutal force. What stepped out wasn't a captive. It was something far worse. A man dropped to the dirt, eyes cold and calculating, his face carved with scars like a ledger of sins. He stood straight, unbound, very much alive. His name was Bram Hallow, known across the frontier as the Butcher of Abilene. $3,000 rode on his head, and every lawman from here to the coast knew his face. Crowell felt the color drain from his skin, because in that instant, he understood. This wasn't a prisoner. It was the last dawn he would ever see. When Bram Hallow's boots hit the street, the town went silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if nature itself sensed a predator had arrived. Crowell's hand froze mid-draw. His mouth went dry. Behind him, Mercer, Halden, and Pike were doing the same grim math, remembering posters, saloon whispers, names that made seasoned killers flinch. That's Hallow, Crowell breathed. Not completely useless after all, the driver said calmly, stepping down from his seat with the easy grace of a man who'd done this more times than he could count. The words carried no heat, just certainty. Behind Bram Hallow, two more figures emerged from the coach. A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd of Dustfall Hold. Faces pale with recognition, names spoken in churches as warnings to children. The second man was Corvin Slate, known as Blackhand. Wanted for a dozen murders, a bank job worth $50,000, and crimes too ugly for print. His eyes swept the street like a wolf, sizing up penned stock. A scar ran from temple to jaw, and his smile promised nothing but endings. The third man was worse. Even without posters or reputation, something about him radiated pure malice. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His name was Eyre Blackthorn, and the street knew fear. His name was Eyre Blackthorn, the mind behind the Black Ridge Massacre. 43 settlers wiped out before sunrise in a single night. More than a decade later, people still bolted awake from nightmares carrying his name on their lips. And now, this old driver had brought all three of them in alive. Now listen carefully, the driver said, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. I'm going to tell you exactly how today is going to end. He moved toward Vance Crowell at a slow, deliberate pace. Every step carried weight. Every step counted down to bloodshed. You're going to ease your hand away from that gun, he continued calmly. You're going to tell your friends to do the same. Then you're going to step aside. Crowell's fingers trembled. Sweat ran down his face despite the cool morning air. And if we don't? One of the other gunmen challenged, trying and failing to sound brave. The driver stopped inches from Crowell. In the harsh daylight, the scars along his forearms stood out clearly. Cuts, burns, bullet marks layered over decades. His eyes were colder still. In them lived the memory of every man he had ever put into the ground. Then you become my responsibility, he said quietly. And I am very good at what I do. Crowell's hand finally dropped. The tension on Main Street snapped tight as a drawn wire. Every window in Dustfall Hold held a face. Every doorway hid a witness. This was the kind of moment towns remembered forever. The day a shadow dared to walk in open daylight. But Crowell's men weren't all ready to quit. The youngest, barely past 25, still edged his hand toward his revolver. His eyes flicked between the driver and Crowell, waiting for an order that never came. You really think you're faster than us, old man? He called out, his voice cracking. 3 against 1 ain't good odds. The driver didn't even look at him. His attention never left Crowell. He watched for a twitch, a flinch, any hint of betrayal. This was the most dangerous second. Cornered animals were unpredictable. There's 4 of them, Corvin Slate said from beside the coach. His scarred face hinted at amusement, but his eyes held only calculation, the kind learned by measuring distances between heartbeats. Maybe they'll surprise us. Keep quiet, the driver snapped. They're my concern. From inside the carriage, Ire Blackthorn laughed, a dry, splitting sound like bones snapping. "Let them try," he rasped. "Let them try so we can watch this old devil work." "I've heard stories about you," Blackthorn added. "Silver Creek, 7 men. You faced them alone." "It was 6," the driver replied evenly. "7 dead," Blackthorn said. "Only 6 men," the driver corrected. The meaning hung in the air like a falling blade. Crowell made his choice. His revolver slipped free of his grip as he raised both hands. "We're leaving," he told his men. "All of us. Now." "But now," Crowell snapped, his voice sharp with the authority of a man swallowing defeat. The 4 of them backed away toward the saloon. But the driver wasn't finished. He followed them, one measured step at a time. He didn't threaten them with words anymore. His presence alone carried the promise of consequences. "One last thing," he said as Crowell reached the saloon doors. "Tell your friends. Tell every gunslinger, rustler, and 2-bit outlaw in this territory that Bram Hallow, Corvin Slate, and Ire Blackthorn are headed to Fort McCullough under federal custody. That bounty, $25,000, is already claimed." He paused. "And if anyone decides to play hero before we reach that fort?" He smiled. It was the most terrifying expression Crowell had ever seen. When Crowell and his men disappeared inside the saloon, the driver turned toward the gathered crowd of Dustfall Hold. He lifted his hands in a gesture that almost looked peaceful, yet carried nothing but warning. "My name is Eamon Graves," he said, his voice heavy with years. "I've been tracking these 3 for nearly a year. They're wanted men, dangerous men, and I'm delivering them to Fort McCullough for federal judgment." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some faces tightened with recognition. The name Eamon Graves belonged to legend, one most folks believed had been buried long ago. Stories aged faster than the men who lived them. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" called Marshal Oric Vale from across the street. He was an honest man, but he'd never faced anything like this. Graves met his eyes. "You don't," he said simply. "You either take my word or you don't. But those 3," he gestured toward the coach, "carry $10,000 each on their heads. Federal warrants, documented, and they're coming with me." The street stayed silent. "How did you take all 3 of them by yourself?" someone from Dustfall Hold asked, curiosity cutting through the fear. Eamon Graves didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back to the wagon and rolled up his sleeve, exposing his left arm. It was a map of violence. Knife scars, bullet wounds, burn marks layered one over another. A lifetime written into flesh. "I've been doing this for 40 years, he said at last. "I learned early that catching dangerous men isn't about drawing fast, it's about thinking farther ahead." He paused. "In Silver Creek, I watched them for 2 weeks, learned their habits, their rhythms. I placed local law along their escape routes before I ever showed myself. They thought they were hunting me." His eyes hardened. I was already waiting where they needed to run. He turned back toward the 3 prisoners. They believed they could outrun their pasts, thought they could slip into Mexico and start over in the wild. He shook his head once. "The past doesn't get tired. It follows you like a shadow." "And what about you?" Marshal Oric Vale asked. "What are you running from?" Graves stayed silent for a long moment. His eyes carried memories that would have crushed lesser men. "I stopped running years ago," he said finally. "Now I just make sure others answer for theirs." He climbed back onto the wagon seat. "We leave in 5 minutes," he called out. Anyone tries to stop us, this ends ugly. Marshal Vale stood in the center of Main Street, torn between his badge and the undeniable truth that he was completely outmatched. Eamon Graves wasn't a threat to the town. He was a force passing through it. Trying to stop him would have been like fighting a dust storm barehanded. Let him go, Vale said at last, turning to his deputy. Finn Calder, pale and shaken, nodded. If anyone causes trouble, Vale added, you arrest them. This isn't our fight. The people of Dustfall Hold slowly dispersed, drifting back toward their shops and homes. Some lingered in doorways, watching history finish unfolding. Stories like this didn't stay stories long. They turned into legend by nightfall. By morning, every saloon from here to San Francisco would be buzzing with it. Graves secured Bram Hallow, Corvin Slate, and Ire Blackthorne back inside the carriage. His movements were efficient, practiced. Chains clinked, locks snapped shut. A routine sharpened by decades. These men were too dangerous to leave even a second unguarded. As Graves climbed onto the driver's seat, he noticed Vance Crowell watching from behind the saloon doors. Fear in his eyes, tangled with something darker. Respect, maybe. Or the shame of knowing how close he'd come to dying. Graves met his gaze briefly. That was all it took. Next time, there would be no mercy. He snapped the reins, and the ancient wagon rolled out of town, heading northeast toward Fort McCullough. 3 days of hard travel lay ahead. Canyons, desert flats, mountain passes. Dangerous ground even without 3 of the most wanted men in the territory chained behind you. From inside the carriage, voices drifted out. That went easier than I expected, Corvin Slate muttered, his scarred face appearing at the small window. I thought Graves might give us a chance to run. He did. Ire Blackthorne replied, his tone edged with real respect. In Silver Creek, we ran. We had guns, Blackthorne continued. Surprise on our side. Didn't matter. Bram Hallow said nothing, staring into something only he could see. What's wrong, Butcher? Blackthorne taunted. Never met a man you couldn't scare? Hallow's voice was low when he answered. I've never met a man who didn't want me dead quickly. Graves doesn't rush. He paused. He savors the work. As the wagon crested a rise overlooking Dustfall Hold, Eamon Graves allowed himself the slightest smile. He had brought in men far worse than these. Still, something about this job felt wrong. Something in the way Crowell had looked at him, fear tangled with envy. Graves couldn't shake the sense that this journey wasn't finished yet. The land opened up as the wagon rolled down into the desert. Red rock towers stood like silent sentries along the trail. The heat climbed steadily as the sun rose high. This was country where men vanished, where heat killed as cleanly as a bullet, where water mattered more than gold. Graves had crossed this land 100 times, and he knew better than to trust familiarity. The desert thrived on deception, mirages, false trails, empty promises. And it was where men with nothing left to lose made their last stand. 15 miles out, he noticed the dust plume behind him. At first, he mistook it for a wandering wind devil, one of those sudden columns that rise and vanish without warning. But this cloud held its shape. It followed. And Graves knew exactly what that meant. Word had already ridden out from Dustfall Hold. Someone had carried news to a party eager to know Eamon Graves's position. It might have been federal marshals sent to back the transfer. It could just as easily have been bounty hunters hoping to steal his cargo. Or worse, something personal. From inside the carriage, Corvin Slate noticed it too. We've got company, he said through the narrow window. 3, maybe 4 riders. I see them, Graves answered evenly. He didn't press the pace. Fear invited pursuit, and urgency smelled like weakness. Instead, he kept the horses moving at a steady trot, drawing the riders deeper into the open desert, like a predator guiding challengers into familiar ground. The gap closed. Graves studied their silhouettes, the way they sat their saddles, the rhythm of their approach. Then recognition struck. The lead rider was Vance Crowell, the same young gun who'd folded back in town. Behind him rode 3 harder men, their posture trained, their spacing deliberate. Crowell had bought muscle. Humiliation, it seemed, demanded repayment. "Graves," Crowell shouted, forcing confidence into his voice. "I want a word with you." Graves brought the wagon to a halt and turned calmly on the seat. He moved like a man who had faced violence his entire life and learned its first rule. Haste was unnecessary. Violence required intent. "You've got my attention," Graves said, for about 30 seconds. Crowell urged his horse closer. His hired men fanned out, spreading into a shallow arc. Graves felt the familiar weight of the revolver at his side. Crowell stopped 20 yards out, close enough to talk, far enough to believe he was safe. The 3 men widened their spacing, forming a textbook ambush meant to rattle ordinary prey. Graves wasn't ordinary. "I've been thinking," Crowell said, his voice strained with manufactured bravado. "Back in town, you made me look weak, in front of everyone." "No," Graves replied flatly. The word hit harder than a slap. Crowell hesitated. He hadn't expected refusal. "You're not worth the effort," Graves went on, patient as a schoolteacher. "You're worried about your reputation because you know what you are. You're not a gunslinger. You're a thief who survived long enough to borrow the title." He nodded toward the hired men. "And the help you paid for? They're disposable." One of the gunmen, a thin man with a scar drawn tight across his throat, started to pull his revolver. Graves moved. The gun seemed to appear in his hand, the shot cracking across the desert like thunder. The man's arms snapped upward, fingers flying open as his pistol dropped into the sand. Blood spilled from his shoulder as he screamed. Graves hadn't stood, hadn't aimed. He'd fired from the hip and hit exactly what he intended. The remaining 2 gunmen froze, hands hovering inches from their weapons, unwilling to finish the motion. They had just witnessed the impossible. A man seated on a wagon drawing faster than a mounted rider who saw it coming. "This is how it ends," Graves said calmly, as if discussing the weather. "You turn your horses around. You ride back to Dustfall Hold, and you tell everyone you meet that Vance Crowell is a dead man if he ever follows this wagon again." He locked eyes with Crowell. "You understand? I'm giving you one mercy, one chance to walk away. After that," he added, "I finish it the way I finish everything, clean and final." Crowell's face drained to ash. He'd believed numbers would save him, believed fear could be manufactured. He was wrong. "Let's go," Crowell said quietly. He turned his horse. The others followed. As they rode off, Graves reloaded his revolver with careful precision, 1 round at a time, then guided the wagon back onto the trail toward Fort McCullough. Night had already swallowed the desert, painting it in deep violet and black before the stars burned through like scattered diamonds. Graves made camp in a narrow canyon where stone walls broke the wind and limited approach. He chained the prisoners inside the carriage, reinforcing the door frame, excessive for common criminals. But these men were not common. Bram Hallow had once broken out of a federal prison in Denver. Corvin Slate had picked locks using nothing but a sliver of bone. And Ire Blackthorne had escaped places that were never meant to be escaped. Graves sat with his back to the fire, eyes on the canyon rim, knowing this job was far from finished. Eamon Graves sat near the dying fire, the bitter heat of black coffee warming his scarred hands. When a voice drifted from inside the carriage, "Can I ask you something, Graves?" It was Bram Hallow. The butcher of Abilene didn't sound hostile now, just curious. "How did you take us in Silver Creek? I've gone over it 100 times, and it still doesn't add up." Graves weighed the question. Most men wouldn't explain their methods to prisoners. But most men weren't Eamon Graves. He didn't speak to educate Hallow. He spoke because absolute victory allowed the luxury of truth. "You were setting an ambush inside the town," Graves said at last. 3 kill zones, planned exits. "You thought you could predict my path." "We did," Corvin Slade added from the shadows of the carriage. "We knew where you'd enter. Only one approach from that side." "Exactly," Graves replied. "You read my movements perfectly." He took a slow sip of coffee. "So, I didn't take the route you expected. I crossed the mountains instead. Cost me 3 extra days. But you weren't counting on patience. You were counting on efficiency." He stared into the fire. "While you were arranging your trap, I was already in town. I paid local law to cover every exit. When you finally struck, expecting to find me bleeding inside your net, I was already standing behind every way out." Bram Hallow laughed quietly. There was no mockery in it, only respect, sharpened by defeat. "You treated us like a puzzle," he said. "Not a fight. That's why you won," Hallow continued. "That's why you always win." "That's why I'm still alive," Graves said. Even as the words left him, unease crept in. Something about this run felt wrong. This haul didn't sit right. Graves had survived 40 years by trusting his instincts, and they were screaming now, telling him this transport would not end the way it was supposed to. The feeling had followed him ever since leaving Dustfall Hold. An itch reason couldn't quiet. Federal marshals were scheduled to meet him at Fort McCullough. Orders had come through official channels. But as dawn crept over the canyon, Graves noticed something that stopped him cold. Fresh horse tracks. They ran parallel to his trail. Not bandits, not bounty hunters. The spacing was clean, disciplined, almost military. Something was very wrong. The realization had barely settled when the canyon exploded with gunfire. Rifle shots hammered down from above, stone and sand erupting around the wagon. Graves didn't panic. He'd been under fire before these men learned to shave. He moved with controlled precision, cutting the harness, driving the horses free, diving behind the largest rock formation. Inside the carriage, the prisoners shouted questions. Graves ignored them. His eyes tracked the canyon rim, counting flashes. 7 shooters, possibly 8. Coordinated, trained. Rifles, not pistols. "Federal marshals," a voice called down from above. "Release your prisoners and step out with your hands clear." Graves felt his blood chill. That wasn't martial protocol. That was someone reading from a script. Someone had been given exact instructions. These weren't marshals. Someone had sent professionals to kill him and reclaim the prisoners, and they'd used federal supply routes to do it. The formation on the ridge told him everything. "I have 3 federal prisoners under custody," Graves shouted back, buying time. "I'm armed and protected." "Come out and we'll discuss this properly," the voice answered. "You've got 30 rifles trained on your position." 10 seconds, the voice added. Graves calculated fast. 30 rifles meant organized military or private contractors. Colonel Thaddeus Virex had the influence for both. Private security meant someone had paid heavily. Someone wanted Bram Hallow, Corvin Slate, and Ire Blackthorne badly enough to intercept them in open desert. These men were never meant to reach Fort McCullough. They were being reclaimed. Graves glanced toward the carriage. Faces pressed to the narrow window. Bram Hallow's confusion hardened into understanding. Corvin Slate was smiling. And Ire Blackthorne? Blackthorne was laughing. "This is a retrieval," Hallow called out. "Someone sent you to take us back." He paused, "Which means you made a serious mistake." Graves finished the thought silently. The $25,000 bounty had never been real. They were worth that price not because of the bounty, but because the man who had taken them had seized something far more dangerous than their freedom. Eamon Graves's mind accelerated, thoughts cutting sharper than gunfire. 30 armed shooters held the high ground. 3 prisoners already claimed by a coordinated force, a net woven with care. Him at its center. "Who sent you?" Graves called out. His voice stayed level, despite the deadly arithmetic surrounding him. Federal authority? Private security? Or men desperate enough to gamble everything? Silence followed. Then another voice rose from the canyon rim, older, commanding, weighted with regret. "It's me, Eamon." Graves went rigid. He knew that voice. He had last heard it 2 years ago, and hearing it again felt like standing over a grave he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The man on the ridge was near 70 now. Scarred, worn, but unmistakable. Colonel Thaddeus Vierex, once his commander, and the man who had ordered the massacre that had forged Graves's reputation as a killer. "Vierex," Graves said flatly. It wasn't a question. "Hello, Eamon," Vierex replied. His voice carried nostalgia, regret, and something colder beneath it. "You've aged, sharpened. I've followed your work for 3 years." "What do you want?" Graves asked. "The prisoners," Vierex said simply. "They aren't criminals. They're soldiers. They worked for me before they ran. The government is reopening Black Ridge. Investigators, committees. Those 3 are the only men alive who know the full truth. I need them back alive." "Dead men speak through silence," Vierex continued. "Living men can still be managed." From inside the carriage, Corvin Slate laughed openly. "I told you," he shouted to Bram Hallow. "Told you he'd know what we really were." Graves felt the weight of realization settle over him like a burial cloth. He had hunted them by bounty posters, never questioned who printed them, never asked who benefited. This was never justice. It was erasure. "They killed 60 people," Graves said, his voice steady despite the fire burning behind his eyes. "Settlers, women, children. I tracked them 8 months. They followed orders," Vierex corrected. "Hard orders, but orders all the same. That was war, Eamon. You know what war demands." "No," Graves replied. "War is fought between armies. What they did was slaughter." Vierex's expression hardened. "I'm giving you a choice," he said. "Stand aside and ride away. Keep pushing this, and we put you down." Graves studied the 30 rifles trained on him, calculated distance, angles, survival. Then he made a decision that would fracture everything. He stood from behind the rock. Slowly, hands visible, revolver untouched. 30 barrels followed his movement. One trigger pull could end it all, but Vierex wanted compliance, not a corpse. That hesitation was Graves's only advantage. Before he spoke, memory struck, violent and sudden. Silver Creek, Smoke, screams, children crying, soldiers obeying orders. That was why he hunted men like Bram Hallow. Not for money, for penance. But what if the penance itself had been built on lies? You want to know why I spent 8 months tracking them? Graves called out. Because bounty posters don't lie about faces. Those men murdered innocents. And I swore a long time ago I would never stop hunting men like that. Then make a promise to me instead. Virex answered. Let them go. Take the payment. Live the rest of your life in peace. Peace, Graves repeated, and the way he said it made even the soldiers on the ridge tighten their grips. I haven't known peace for 40 years, Colonel, Eamon Graves said quietly. Not since Silver Creek. Not since I understood what war truly is. Not since I watched soldiers obey orders while children burned. Colonel Thaddeus Virex flushed, anger rising fast. That was a strategic decision. That was a war crime, Graves replied without hesitation. He moved in the next heartbeat with the speed that had turned him into a frontier legend. His hand flashed, not to draw his revolver, but to seize the carriage door and rip it open. The prisoners spilled out. They weren't bound. They had never been. Graves had realized the truth the moment Virex's voice echoed through the canyon. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a test of loyalty, of obedience, of who he truly was. Run, Graves shouted. Then he did the unthinkable. He fired, not at men, but at the canyon ridge. The bullet struck an ammunition cache hidden among the rocks. Whoever planned the ambush had made a fatal mistake, stacking explosives too close to the firing positions. The blast tore through the canyon like thunder given form. Stone and metal rained down. Fire rolled across the ridge. Men screamed as the shockwave hurled them backward. Virex's command structure vanished in a single, roaring instant. Graves was already moving. He sprinted for the canyon wall, using the chaos as cover. Behind him, the prisoners scattered in different directions. Corvin's slate broke north. Ire Blackthorn ran east. Bram Hallow vanished into the rocks. They were free, and they knew exactly who had freed them. As Graves reached the wall and began to climb, Hallow's voice echoed across the canyon. You magnificent bastard, you were playing everyone. Graves didn't answer. He was finally grasping the real cost of his reputation. And why some men, even those he once hunted, mattered more than any reward. He crested the rim as flames still devoured the supply cache. Bodies lay strewn across the stone, some stirring, others still. Graves didn't look at them. Death had long since lost its power over him. Virex was alive, broken, bleeding, struggling against the rock where the blast had thrown him. Why? Virex gasped, blood pouring from a gash on his forehead. You could have had everything. Money, rank, a life far from this madness. Because men like you never stop, Graves said, kneeling beside him. You keep ordering, keep demanding, keep destroying lives for objectives that don't survive the next war. He hauled Virex upright, not from mercy, but so the man would hear what came next face to face. Those 3 men you sent me to capture? Graves said. I'm letting them go. No bounty, no justice, just freedom. And you're going to live the rest of your life knowing the soldier you shaped, the killer you created, finally drew a line. You'll regret this, Virex hissed, the certainty of command still clinging to his voice. The government will hunt you. Let them, Graves replied. He stood and walked away, leaving his former commander to the mercy of the desert. As Graves descended the far side of the canyon, He found them waiting. All three. Bram Hallow, Corvin Slate, Ire Blackthorn. They had chosen not to vanish into the wild. Their faces carried gratitude tangled with shame, the look of men who understood both the gift and its price. "What now?" Hallow asked. There was no threat in the question, only honesty, the first step toward something else. "Now you disappear," Graves said. "You go far enough that no one ever hunts you again. And you remember this moment. Remember that one man chose to free you instead of claiming the bounty." "Why?" Corvin Slate asked quietly. For the first time, there was no edge in his voice. "Because I'm tired," Eamon Graves said simply. "I'm tired of gathering ghosts," Eamon Graves said softly. "Tired of running from Silver Creek. And maybe it's time someone proved redemption is real. Even for men like you. Even for men like me." As the three former prisoners walked toward the horses that would carry them into freedom, Graves turned back toward the canyon. Smoke still curled into the morning sky, the last breath of Colonel Thaddeus Virex's ambition. Graves rode alone toward Dustfall Hold, the old wagon trailing behind him like a memory that refused to die. The prisoners were gone. The federal bounties remained unclaimed. His reputation, the only thing he had built over 40 years, was finished. It should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt like breathing for the first time in decades. He entered Dustfall Hold at sunset and reined in beside the marshal's office, where Marshal Oric Vale stood waiting. Shock crossed the marshal's face, then confusion, then understanding as he noticed the empty wagon. "Where are they?" Vale asked. "Gone," Graves replied. "I let them go." "You did what?" Vale's voice rose. "You're a bounty hunter. That's all you—" "I was many things," Graves cut in. "I decided I don't want to be that anymore." Vale stared at him, stunned. "The government will come looking. For them and for you." Graves looked past the town, toward the open desert where a man could vanish if he chose. "I'm leaving," he said. "I'll find a place where no one knows my name. No one knows about the bodies. No one knows about the blood. I want to remember what it feels like to be a man instead of a shadow." He climbed down from the wagon, joints protesting under the weight of years. "Take the wagon," he added. "It's paid for. Use it however you want." "And the prisoners?" Vale asked. "Bram Hallow, Corvin Slate, Ire Blackthorn." "They're free men," Graves said. "What they do with that freedom is their choice." Across the street, Vance Crowell stepped out of the saloon, watching from a distance. For a brief moment, his eyes met Graves's. In that glance lived the truth of how close both men had come to different endings. How a single decision could rewrite a life. Graves tipped his hat in farewell to the town that had brushed against normalcy for just a moment. Then he turned his horse toward the mountains and rode into anonymity, like a man finally setting his gun down. The small mountain town of Stillwater Kin, tucked deep in New Mexico, carried no bounty posters, no shootouts, no legends. It was simply a place for men whose old lives had burned away. There, Eamon Graves became Eamon Graves no longer. To the townsfolk, he was just Eamon Graves, a quiet carpenter. His hands, once tools of death, now raised homes, churches, and schoolhouses. He spoke little, asked nothing, and no one asked about his past. Sometimes, in the evenings, strangers passed through and told stories. They said 3 men, Bram Hallow, Corvin Slate, and Ire Blackthorn, had been seen far south, building a peaceful settlement in the Mexican wilderness. They said the men who once terrorized the West now protected families instead of hunting them. They lived quietly, They chose differently. Stories also claimed Colonel Thaddeus Virex survived the canyon blast. But something inside him had shattered. He vanished from public life, rumored to be living somewhere back east, haunted by the knowledge that his empire of control had been undone by a single act of mercy. One evening, as Graves closed his carpentry shop, a familiar figure appeared. It was Bram Hallow. The butcher of Abilene looked changed, less carved by violence, softened by peace. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, with 2 children at her side. Elara Hallow, Marek, and Wren. Real joy radiated from them. "I wanted you to know," Hallow said, his voice free of the menace it once carried, "that what you gave us, our freedom, was the greatest gift of my life." "What brings you here?" Graves asked, though he already knew. "To thank you," Hallow said, "and to tell you that choosing redemption over revenge changed everything. For me, for Slate, for Blackthorn." "So am I," Graves replied quietly. As Hallow and his family disappeared back into the mountains, Eamon Graves looked up at the stars. He thought of the wagon, the desert, the countless moments where he could have chosen differently. For 40 years, he had collected death like other men collected gold. He had been feared. He had been invisible. But here, where no one knew his name, he was finally alive. And so ends the tale of the Reaper's wagon. The story of a man who spent 40 years chasing death, only to discover that true redemption came not from gold, but from mercy. Eamon Graves chose to be more than a shadow. He chose to be human. And what about you? If you stood where he stood, would you have done the same? Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for being here and letting this story live within your heart. If it moved you, I hope you'll walk beside us through more journeys of the Wild West. Stories filled with truth, endurance, and grace. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and stay close. Together, we'll keep riding across these wide-open lands of memory and hope. Thank you. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. Our narratives bring inspiration from the past, recreated with fictional and dramatized interpretations for entertainment purposes only. AI tools serve as creative support, but the storytelling, editing, and emotional refinement are handled by our team to guarantee authenticity. We comply with content policies for AI use, avoiding impersonations, identity fabrication, or historically misleading images. All visual and audio content is legally sourced. Redistribution or modification requires prior written approval. Thank you for honoring creativity, collaboration, and storytelling done with heart.